Chapter 6. Separation, War, and Covenant. The quarrel started over grass. Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen had been competing for the same pasture since we returned from Egypt. The wealth that Abram carried out of Pharaoh's household, the livestock and servants, and the sprawling increase that came from prosperity in a land not quite recovered from famine, had made both camps too large for the territory between Bethel and Ai. The flocks pressed against each other, and the wells were contested. And the men who tended the animals did what men always do when resources run short. They argued. I heard the fights before I saw them. Raised voices at the water points and shoving matches near the grazing boundaries. Lot's senior herdsman and Abram's senior herdsman standing nose to nose over a stretch of grass that neither of them owned, both of them claiming rights they didn't have in a land God had promised to Abram but hadn't yet delivered. The Canaanites watched. Their own settlements dotted the hills around Bethel, and they watched the Hebrew camps fracture with the quiet satisfaction of people who enjoy seeing newcomers fail. Abram settled it the way I didn't expect. He took Lot to a ridge above the camp where the land spread out below them in every direction. The Jordan Valley to the east, green and watered, the river cutting through it like a vein. The hills of Canaan to the west, rocky and sparse by comparison. The contrast was obvious. The valley looked like life, and the hills looked like endurance. Let's not have quarreling between us, Abram said. Or between our herdsmen. We're family. Lot nodded, his eyes on the valley. I'd been watching him long enough to read what he was calculating before he opened his mouth. The whole land is before you, Abram said. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. Choose. Choose. Abram, the one God had called, the one who carried the promise, was giving the first choice to his nephew. The better land, the richer pasture, the more strategic position. Abram was handing it away. I wanted to intervene. Not physically, not to override anyone's will, but I wanted to shout at Lot. Choose the hills. Choose the hard ground, and the sparse water and the land that doesn't look like much. Because the valley, for all its green abundance, bordered Sodom. I could feel the corruption radiating from that city the way you feel heat from a forge. The fallen had built their systems there with a thoroughness that made look restrained. Sodom was saturated. And Lot was looking at the green grass and the flowing water and not seeing what lived underneath. Lot chose the valley. I'll take the Jordan plain, Lot said. He didn't hesitate, didn't look at Abram's face, and didn't ask which direction Abram preferred. He saw the best land, and he took it. Abram let him go. There was no argument, no negotiation, and no reminder that God had promised this entire land to Abram's descendants and Lot was helping himself to the richest portion. Abram just stood on the ridge and watched his nephew pack his household and move east toward the valley and toward Sodom, and his face showed nothing but the steady grief of a man losing family to a choice he won't contest. After Lot left, God spoke. Look around from where you are, God said to Abram. To the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Offspring like dust. Spoken to a man with no children. Spoken after his nephew, his closest family, had just chosen to leave. The promise expanding at the exact moment Abram's household was shrinking. Abram moved south to Hebron, to the great trees of Mamre. He built an altar there, and by now I knew his pattern. Every new place, every fresh start. Abram stacked stones and chose a lamb and offered sacrifice and called on the name of the Lord. It was always his first move. I settled into the Hebron assignment, established the perimeter, and filed my report to Michael. Lot gone, Abram's stable, fallen activity moderate. Routine. Then the kings went to war. The battle looked different from where I was standing. 4 kings from the east, Kedorlaomer and his allies, marched against 5 kings of the Jordan Valley, Sodom and Gomorrah among them. The humans saw what they always see: armies moving, territories contested, old debts collected at sword point. What I saw ran deeper. It was a coordinated assault, and Siriel had built it. Not directly. He wouldn't expose himself for a regional war, but he'd been moving pieces into position for years. Patient the way the fallen are patient when they believe time is on their side. And his target wasn't the kings. It was Lot. Lot, who lived near Sodom, was Abram's family, connected to the seed promised by blood, if not by covenant. When Kedorlaomer's forces defeated the 5 kings and took Sodom's people captive, Lot and his household were swept up with the rest. Prisoners, they marched east with the spoils. I saw him in the column, just a face among hundreds being driven east with their hands bound. But I knew what he was: Abram's family. A blood connection to the promise. Walking away from Canaan with no idea anyone was coming for him. I got the report from an angel stationed in the valley, and I stayed close to the messenger, one of the survivors who'd escaped the battle and run to Hebron. Not that I could carry news myself, but I could be there when it arrived. The man delivered it the human way, gasping and frightened, and I watched Abram's face transform. Not fear this time. Not the calculation I'd seen before Egypt. Something older and harder. A man whose family has been taken and who knows exactly what he's going to do about it. Abram armed his household, 318 trained men. Servants who'd been with him since Men he'd drilled and equipped and prepared for exactly this kind of crisis. I hadn't known about the training until that moment. He'd kept it quiet, built up in pieces across seasons, and I hadn't seen what it added up to until Abram started pulling them into formation. They moved that night. Abram divided his men into groups and pursued Kedorlaomer's forces north to Dan, then beyond, striking at night in a coordinated attack that shouldn't have worked. 118 against an army that had defeated 5 kings. The odds were absurd. I fought in the same battle. Not beside Abram's men, where they could see me. In the realm they couldn't see. Michael had authorized a detail for this one. 6 angels assigned to me before we left Hebron. When Abram's night attack hit the eastern camp, we moved. The fallen who accompanied Kedorlaomer's forces had positioned themselves around the captives, Lot's group especially. I'd seen this kind of perimeter before, the kind meant to hold rather than destroy, because a living prisoner is more useful than a dead one. They wanted Lot in enemy territory and away from Abram. They wanted the seed line severed at its nearest branch. We came in from the north where their lines were thinnest. The first one I hit was a regional commander, old enough to have served before the rebellion, and he turned on me with something that had once been strength but had long since gone wrong. We struggled in the dark above the human camp. I took a hit across the shoulder that bent me sideways, and for a moment I couldn't see anything but white. Then I found my footing and drove forward. The fallen around Lot's group hadn't turned yet. They were watching Abram's assault on the human side, counting 318 men against their army's numbers, running the math the way the fallen always do, adding up everything except the factor that never shows in their calculations. When our push cracked their perimeter from the north, they scattered, not in defeat, but in surprise. They'd built their position for a human-level fight, and it hadn't stopped there. I cleared the spiritual ground around the prisoners. 2 of my detail took hits I didn't see clearly. One went down hard and didn't get up before I lost sight of him in the press of the fight. Then it was over. The fallen hadn't expected Abram to come after them. They'd read him as a nomad herder who'd count his losses and stand down. They were wrong, and when their command broke, the rest collapsed with it. Abram recovered everything: the people, the goods, Lot and his household. All of it. And then, on the road back to Hebron, we encountered Melchizedek. I didn't see him coming, and none of us did. He appeared on the road near Salem as if he'd been waiting. A man I'd never seen in all my years here. Carrying a title I didn't know any human could carry. King of Salem. Priest of God Most High. Priest of the true God. Not from Abram's line, not from any branch of Shem's descendants I'd been tracking. He wasn't in any genealogy I'd ever filed a report on. This man served the God of creation, and I had no record of him anywhere. He brought bread and wine. Simple provisions offered with a gravity that turned a roadside meeting into a ceremony. I stood near enough to hear every word, and I could feel the spiritual weight of the moment pressing down on us. Not the cosmic audience gathering that accompanied God's direct speech. Quieter than that. A focused attention, as if heaven were leaning in to listen to a conversation it had been waiting for. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, Melchizedek said. His voice was steady and clear. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Abram gave him a tenth of everything recovered from the battle without hesitation or negotiation. The man who'd refused to let Pharaoh make him rich, who'd walked out of Egypt with another man's gifts under duress, now freely gave a portion of his victory to a priest he'd just met because Melchizedek served the same God, and Abram recognized it instantly. I filed it away. Bread and wine from a priest king who served God without being part of any line I'd been tracking. A blessing given and received. A mystery that didn't fit any pattern I'd been following. I didn't understand it, and I still don't. What I did understand was what happened next. The king of Sodom approached Abram with an offer: keep the goods and return the people. Abram refused. I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Abram told the king of Sodom, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal. You will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. Not a thread, not a sandal strap. The man who'd kept Pharaoh's livestock without a word of protest now refused Sodom's wealth with an oath. Something had changed in Abram since Egypt. The fear was still there, and it would surface again. But something harder had grown alongside it. A determination that his wealth, his provision, his future would come from God and not from the corrupt systems of the cities around him. I saw Siriel watching from the perimeter as Abram turned away from the king of Sodom, watching with the expression of someone recalculating. He'd positioned the war to put Lot in enemy hands and Abram in debt to Sodom. But neither had worked. So he'd need a different approach. Abram returned to Hebron and the camp quieted. The battle was behind him. Lot was back in the valley near Sodom, having learned nothing from his capture. The household settled, the flocks grazed, the servants went about their work. Everything was as good as it could be for a man with no children and a promise that required them. God came to Abram at night. In a vision, not in the waking world, but the effect on the spiritual realm was indistinguishable. When God spoke, the boundary between vision and reality bent under the weight of his presence. Do not be afraid, Abram, God said. I am your shield, your very great reward. And Abram, for the first time in my hearing, pushed back. Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? Abram said. You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. The honesty of it stopped me. Not complaint, not rebellion, but the raw truth of a man who has been promised descendants like dust and stars, and has waited years, and has nothing to show for it but aging bones and a barren wife, and a servant who will inherit everything because there is no son. God's response was not rebuke. This man will not be your heir, God said. A son coming from your own body will be your heir. Then God brought Abram outside, into the night, under the stars. And this is what I witnessed. Angels arrived not from nearby posts, but from everywhere, from the eastern borders and the northern territories and the upper regions and the depths of space where the patrol routes ran between galaxies. They came in numbers I hadn't seen since the flood. filling the sky above Hebron in layers, rank upon rank, silent and watchful and present. The fallen came too. Drawn by the same resonance that drew us, they gathered beyond the perimeter in their own formations, and for once they weren't testing or probing or attacking. They were watching, and I thought about that afterward. Maybe they came to find the flaw in it, to be there if the promise collapsed. Or maybe, like us, they just couldn't stay away. Michael was there and Gabriel was there. Angels whose names I didn't know and whose rank was so far above mine that their presence alone pressed me to my knees. God spoke to Abram under the stars. Look up at the sky and count the stars if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. I looked up with Abram. I'd seen those stars from the other side, from the spaces between them, from the cold emptiness where I'd fought and patrolled and traveled for longer than Earth had existed. I knew their number, but Abram didn't. He just saw light, scattered across the dark, more than he could count. And Abram believed God. I felt it happen. Not a sound, not a visible change, but a shift in the spiritual weight of the moment. Something settled between Abram and God that hadn't been there before. A transaction. Abram's belief. His trust in a promise that contradicted everything his body and his circumstances told him, was received by God and credited to him as righteousness. Righteousness. Not because Abram had earned it, not because he'd never failed. He'd lied in Egypt, given his wife to a king, and kept the livestock. And now God looked at his belief, his bare, stubborn willingness to trust the promise, and called it righteousness. I didn't understand the math, and I still don't. But I witnessed the transaction, and it changed how I understood everything that came after. Then God made the covenant. He told Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abram cut the larger animals in half and arranged them in 2 rows, creating a path between the pieces. The blood soaked into the ground, and the smell of it carried on the evening air. I knew what this was, a blood covenant. Both parties walk between the pieces, binding themselves with an oath sealed in death. May I become like these animals if I break this covenant. I'd seen humans make these covenants with each other. Both parties walked, and both were bound. But Abram didn't walk. A deep sleep fell on him, not natural sleep, but the kind God sends when what's coming is too heavy to watch while it's happening. And God walked the path alone. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch moved between the pieces. The presence of God, physical and unmistakable, passing through the blood path, making the oath and binding himself. The gathered angels were silent, thousands of them, filling the sky above Hebron, and not one made a sound. The fallen were silent too, even Siriel. Because what we were witnessing was God doing something that defied every covenant structure any of us had ever observed. A one-sided covenant. God swearing on himself that the promise would be kept, not depending on Abram's faithfulness and not waiting on Abram to get it right. God alone walking through the blood. God alone bearing the weight of the oath. God alone committing to finish what he had started. Alone, Michael said beside me. That was all. I understood what he meant. The promise had seemed so fragile, so dependent on one man's courage and one man's faithfulness. But God wasn't building on Abram's faithfulness, he was building on his own. God was binding himself to the promise the way a father decides his child will be protected. Not because the child earned it, but because the father said so. Then God spoke to the sleeping Abram, and the words were a prophecy that landed on me like a weight. God said, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." 400 years of slavery, and then deliverance. I tried to calculate what that meant. 400 years of watching. 400 years of guarding the seed through bondage and persecution and whatever else the fallen would throw at it. The promise would be kept, but the keeping would take longer and cost more than I had imagined. The firepot and the torch completed their passage. The covenant was sealed. The angels began to disperse, slowly, as if reluctant to leave a place where something this significant had happened. The fallen retreated into the dark, and their silence lingered after they were gone. Abram slept. I stood over him in the dark, in the smell of blood and smoke. Under the stars he'd been told to count, and I tried to hold everything I'd witnessed in this single season. Lot choosing the green valley and walking toward Sodom. Abram fighting with 318 men and winning a battle that should have been impossible. A priest king from Salem bringing bread and wine and a blessing from a god he served without being called. Abram refusing Sodom's wealth. Abram believing a promise that defied biology. God walking through blood and fire alone, binding himself to finish what he'd started. The promise didn't depend on Abram being perfect. It depended on God being faithful. And God had just sworn in blood that he would be. That should have been enough. It should have resolved every question, settled every doubt, and answered every confusion I'd carried since the garden. God himself had guaranteed the outcome. The seed would continue. The promise would be kept. And 400 years, yes, but kept. But Abram was still asleep, and Sarai was still barren. And the 400 years of slavery were out there ahead of us, unseen but certain. And the stars that Abram couldn't count were the same stars I'd patrolled between, cold and distant. The light from each one taking years to reach the ground where a man slept beside a blood path and dreamed of children he didn't have yet. I stood in the dark beside him and didn't move, not yet.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.